Alien Princess thought her human escort was useless until he defeated 12 assassins. The escort file was 14 pages long. HFY read it twice on the transit pod from the Palace District to Buring Platform 9, once in summary and once in full, and by the time the pod doors opened, she had made her decision. The conquered directorate had insulted her. Not carelessly, deliberately. The man assigned to escort her to Veth Minor, where the ratification ceremony that would end 8 months of succession crisis and prevent a civil war was scheduled in 4 days, was a cargo hauler named Rail Muse, former military, which sounded promising until you reached the sub-file, discharged under Article 14, conduct inconsistent with command authority, stripped of active commission, no reattachment, no reinstatement request on record. He had spent the 11 years since operating a single-hull independent freighter on the outer corridor lanes, moving agricultural equipment and construction polymers between worlds that didn't show up on political maps. He was 43 years old. He had no current security clearance above Class 2. His ship, the one they were presumably using because the Concord's entire registered escort fleet had been grounded pending the new security review that the succession crisis itself had triggered, was a Hero-class light freighter called Constant Margin, 14 years old, rated for bulk cargo and short-lane transit. She was the crown heir of House Vane. Her father was dead. Her uncle was currently contesting the succession with a legal team, and HFY's intelligence staff suspected something considerably less legal waiting in reserve. In 4 days, if she stood on the floor of the Neutral Assembly on Veth Minor and signed the accession protocol in front of independent witnesses, the contest would be legally over. Her uncle's team could argue in courts for decades after, but the throne would be hers. The directorate had given her a cargo hauler and an old ship. She stepped onto Platform 9 and looked for him. He was leaning against a support strut near the docking arm, holding a lidded cup of something hot. He was not wearing a uniform. He was wearing a worn canvas jacket over a dark shirt, work trousers, and boots with a scuff across the left toe that suggested he'd kicked something he shouldn't have kicked recently. He was medium height, medium build, with the kind of face that looked like it had been through a lot of weather and had stopped trying to look surprised by it. He was reading something on a thin data slate. He did not look up when she approached. "Muse," she said. He looked up. His eyes were a light gray-green, the color of old copper. He assessed her in the way people sometimes assessed cargo, cataloging, not curious. "Your Highness," he said, "it was not deferential, it was simply accurate." "I have reviewed your file," HFY said. She was Dihari, pale gold bronze skin, 4-fingered hands, pupils that split vertically in bright light, a voice that carried natural harmonic resonance at frequencies humans found slightly uncomfortable to be addressed by if she was annoyed. She was currently annoyed. "I have a number of concerns." "I've read yours," Rail said. She paused. "My file." The Concord sent it over with the mission brief. He tucked the data slate into his jacket pocket. "You were top of your House Academy cohort by 2 full grades. You speak 4 languages. You're rated in 0 atmosphere emergency protocol. You've logged more diplomatic hours in 8 months than most heirs log in 4 years because your father's illness accelerated everything." He picked up his cup and took a careful sip. "You don't need a bodyguard who looks impressive. You need one who doesn't attract attention." "You sent me no briefing," she said. "No itinerary, no equipment manifest." "The itinerary is simple. We leave, we travel, we arrive. The equipment is the ship." He turned toward the docking arm. "She's fueled. We can depart in 20 minutes if you're ready now." HFY looked at the docking arm. At the end of it, visible through the observation port, hung the Constant Margin, hull panels the color of old iron, transponder array patched with a newer component that didn't quite match the housing, cargo bay doors, showing wear along the seams from 10,000 cycles of open-close open-close. She had been promised an escort. She had been given a logistics footnote. "I will be filing a formal complaint with the directorate upon arrival," she said, following him. "That's your right," Rail said. You have nothing to say to that. I noted it, he said. The constant margin's interior smelled of recycled air and something faintly metallic, the background scent of a ship that had been moving for a long time without stopping long enough for a deep clean. The cockpit was utilitarian, 2 seats, functional instrumentation, a secondary navigation display mounted at an angle that suggested it had been added after the original design and bolted in by someone who cared about function rather than aesthetics. Rail walked through pre-flight with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done it so many times, it no longer required attention. He checked each station in the same order, touching the same points, and Asha noted that despite the apparent casualness, he didn't miss a single step. She settled into the co-pilot chair because there was nowhere else to sit, and she refused to stand for a 14-hour transit leg. Who suggested you for this assignment? She asked. Director Karath Sal. I moved her husband's research equipment to the outer survey stations 4 years running. She said I was reliable. Being reliable at moving equipment is not the same as being reliable at protecting a person. No, Rail agreed. He finished the pre-flight and reached for his coffee cup. It's different, harder. You said harder. You admit protecting a person is beyond your current competence. I said it's different and harder than moving equipment. He glanced at her sideways. I didn't say I couldn't do it. He engaged the docking release. The constant margin pulled away from Platform 9 with the smooth authority of a ship that had made this precise motion thousands of times. Through the viewport, Bering Station fell away, its lights diminishing from a blaze to a scatter to a field of distant points. Asha opened her own work portfolio and began reviewing the assembly protocols. She had read them already, but reviewing them again felt productive. Behind her, at some point during the first hour of transit, she heard Rail's breathing change into the slow rhythm of sleep. She did not turn around. She was reviewing the 3rd section of the ratification instrument when Rail said, conversationally, "We have company." She looked up. He was awake, sitting forward, eyes on the long-range sensor board. His coffee cup was in his left hand and had been, she suspected, for some time. The steam rising from it was minimal. Where, she said. It came out flat, not a question. 11 o'clock off the port bow, high bearing, 3 contacts. He set the cup down with deliberate care. They appeared 8 minutes ago. They've been matching our velocity adjustment ever since. Pirates. No, he studied the board. Transponder registration is suppressed, but the hull silhouettes are military. He was quiet for a moment. Dihari military, Vane-class interdiction cruisers. He looked at her. Are those your uncles? Asha felt her stomach drop through the deck. The Vane-class cruiser program was transferred to House Kale under the equipment partition 6 years ago, she said. Her voice remained steady through a discipline of practice she was suddenly very grateful for. My uncle controls House Kale. Rail looked at the contacts on the board for another moment. Then he looked at her. He has 3 interdiction-class vessels, he said. That's not a kidnapping operation. That's a denial-of-arrival operation. He doesn't need you to disappear. He just needs you to not reach Veth Minor in time. They'll disable the ship, she said. Detain us. They'll board the ship, Rail corrected. Disabling us leaves a record of a weapons discharge. Boarding us as registered neutrals under transit lane inspection protocols gives them paper cover to hold us indefinitely while the paperwork processes. He was already moving, not quickly, but with the specific directedness of someone who had already decided what to do and was simply doing it. Standard interdiction boarding crew is 4 per team. 3 ships, they'll send 1 team each, plus a command element. 12 people, Asha said. Somewhere in that range. He pulled up the ship's interior schematic on the secondary display. I'm going to accept the boarding hail. You're going to, she stopped, controlled herself. They are not legitimate inspectors. No, but fighting the hail means they have justification to use weapons, and 3 cruisers against 1 Hero class doesn't end well in open space. He looked at the schematic. Inside the ship, it's different. You're going to fight a boarding party of 12, inside a cargo freighter. "I'm going to handle it," Rail said. The word choice was precise and deliberate. He glanced at her. "Stay in the cockpit. Lock the hatch behind me. Do not open it until I tell you to. I will not simply sit here while—" "Your Highness," he said it quietly, not over her but through her. "I understand you don't think much of me, that's fine. But in the next few minutes, I need you to trust that I know what I'm doing in a way that you don't, in the same way that I would trust you on an assembly floor because that's your environment and not mine." He held her gaze. "Can you do that?" She looked at him, the light gray-green eyes, the worn jacket, the absolute absence of either fear or performance. "Yes," she said. He nodded once and moved toward the hatch. The boarding hail came 7 minutes later. Rail answered it from the communications panel in the cargo bay. Asha could hear the transmission through the open internal channel she'd activated the moment he left. "Constant margin, you are operating in a contested transit lane. We are conducting a standard cargo verification under Neutral Corridor Protocol 7. Stand by to receive boarding team. Resistance will be noted as obstruction." "Understood," Rail said. His voice carried the exact flat resignation of a cargo hauler who had been boarded before, found it tedious, and had stopped wasting energy on outrage. "Initiating airlock sequence." The transmission closed. She heard him moving in the cargo bay, not hurrying, rearranging something, the scrape of cargo containers shifting on deck plating, the soft mechanical click of something being repositioned. She looked at the interior camera feed she'd pulled up on the secondary display and watched him work. The cargo bay was roughly 30 meters long by 8 wide, filled with sealed polymer freight containers in standard stacking configurations. She watched Rail move through them with an unhurried certainty that looked, from the camera angle, almost like he was doing inventory. He repositioned 3 containers near the forward bulkhead, opening a clear lane down the center of the bay. He checked the magnetic lockdown bolts on a rack of 6 heavy containers along the port wall, checked them twice, then looked at the panel controlling them and adjusted something. He positioned himself at the far end of the bay, near the engineering access, and leaned against the wall. He looked from the camera like a man waiting for something boring to finish. The boarding team came through the starboard airlock in 2 groups. They were wearing Kalefaction tactical armor, matte black, compact, visors down, carrying short-range suppression weapons designed for close-quarters work inside ship hulls. They were professional. They spread through the airlock corridor with practiced efficiency and formed up before entering the cargo bay, the lead element pausing at the threshold to assess the space before committing. Asha watched the camera feed with her hands flat on her thighs to stop them from shaking. The first team entered, 4 operators, weapons raised, moving in a diamond pattern. Behind them, the second team filed in. And behind the second team, a figure in different armor, heavier, command-marked, who paused at the entrance and looked across the length of the bay toward where Rail was standing. "Muse," the commander said. Rail looked up. "Davins." "You didn't go far," the commander said. His voice carried a specific kind of contempt that was also underneath something else. "Cargo hauler, 11 years. It's honest work. You're protecting a political heir for the conquered directorate. That's not honest work. That's a mistake." "Noted," Rail said. And then he moved. It didn't look like combat beginning. It looked like a man pushing off a wall, which is technically what it was, except the wall he pushed off from was 3 feet from the nearest operator, and the movement covered that distance before the operator registered it had started. The first operator went down hard. Rail didn't use a weapon. He used the man's own momentum against the deployment angle he'd already committed to, redirecting the weapon arm up and in, driving the elbow into the visor at the joint between helmet and seal. The crack was audible through the comm feed. The operator folded. The second operator reacted faster, weapon up, suppression charge discharged. A blue-white flash of energy scattered across the cargo bay and struck one of the polymer containers, which absorbed it without comment. Rail was no longer where he had been. He'd moved laterally into the operator's blind spot during the raise and was inside the weapon's effective range before the trigger cleared. He drove his forearm across the weapon barrel, pushing the muzzle down, and used the resulting mechanical pressure to drag the operator off balance and into the third operator who'd been moving to flank. They tangled. Rail stepped back and let them. He used that step to reach the fourth operator. Asha had grown up in a court that valued control of emotion as a survival trait. She had watched her father's advisors manage crises with expressions of total calm while their hands, hidden beneath council tables, gripped the edge hard enough to leave marks. She had learned to do the same. She was gripping the edge of the co-pilot chair hard enough that her forefingers had gone pale. The middle of the cargo bay became a problem. Not because Rail was losing, he wasn't, not technically. The first four operators were down or neutralized within 90 seconds of the engagement opening, which was a number Asha's mind filed away because it did not fit any category she had for it. The problem was the second team of four, who had had 90 seconds to spread out along the port wall and take positions behind the cargo containers, and who were now laying down coordinated suppression fire that carved up the center lane of the bay into something impassable. Rail was behind a stack of containers near the engineering access. The fire was systematic, two firing, two repositioning, keeping pressure constant. He couldn't advance. He couldn't flank without crossing open deck. The commander, Davin, had moved to the starboard wall, away from the crossfire zone. He was watching. "You're good," Davin called. "You've always been good." That was never the argument. Rail didn't answer. "The argument was whether you were reliable," Davin continued. "Whether you could follow an order when following it was hard, and 11 years of evidence suggests no." A suppression burst scorched the top corner of the container stack. Rail pulled back an inch. "You should have let us take those civilians," Davin said. "It was one harvest raid. We get the civilians back through the standard exchange protocol in 6 weeks. Instead, you made a scene, and we had to leave them there, and the exchange never happened because the political situation collapsed." His voice was flat. "That's what your principles cost." Asha was watching the camera feed. She was watching Rail behind the container stack. She was watching the portwall operators' positions, and she was looking at something else. The magnetic lockdown panel near the port wall. The one Rail had adjusted twice before the boarding team arrived. The containers on the port rack were 6 units, each massing roughly 800 kilos. Their magnetic locks were currently, she realized, set to a release threshold that was slightly below the standard. Below what exactly? She looked at the suppression weapons, at the energy discharge pattern, at the heat signature building along the port wall from 2 minutes of sustained fire. Thermal variance. The lock threshold was set to release on thermal variance. They were cooking it themselves. She looked at the panel. She looked at the camera. She looked at Rail, who had not moved, who was waiting for something, who was letting the fire continue. The port wall rack released. 6 containers, 400 and 800 kilos each, dropped off the magnetic rack and onto the deck plating with a sound like a building falling. Not onto the operators, the angle wasn't right for that, and Rail wouldn't have set it for that. Onto the space between them and the wall, blocking their firing lanes, cutting off their positions from the center of the bay. They scrambled. Rail came around the corner of the stack moving at a pace Asha did not have a word for that was not fast, but was something more like inevitable, the pace of something that had decided on a direction and was no longer capable of being redirected. He hit the first scrambling operator before the man had found his footing, drove him into the fallen containers, and was past him by the time the man had decided to fall. The second operator fired at close range. The suppression charge hit Rail in the left shoulder, and he staggered, a genuine stagger, head down, arm dropping, and in the moment the operator committed to the follow-through, Rail's stagger became a tackle, low and total, and the operator went backward over a container, and didn't come back up. Third and fourth operators were together, firing in tandem, and Rail did not try to close on them. He grabbed the nearest fallen container, not an 800-kilo freight unit, a smaller loose crate that had shaken off a secondary rack, and threw it. Not at them, past them. Into the fire suppression valve, mounted on the port wall at head height. The valve burst, the cargo bay filled with suppressant foam in about 4 seconds. The suppression weapons discharged into white. The operators fired at shapes and missed shapes and fired again. Rail didn't fire back. He moved through the foam by feel and layout, and Asha, watching the camera through the white haze with her heart somewhere in her throat, caught glimpses, a hand on a shoulder, redirecting, a brief controlled impact, a weapon skidding across deck plating, a figure sitting down heavily against the forward bulkhead without having chosen to sit. When the foam thinned, there were 8 operators down, and the commander still standing near the starboard wall. And there were 4 left, the last team, who had been holding the airlock corridor as reserve and had now entered the bay with weapons raised. Rail was standing in the center of the bay. His jacket was torn at the shoulder. There was suppressant foam on the left side of his face and chest. His breathing was audible even through the feed, heavy and controlled. He looked at the 4 operators. He looked at the commander. He picked up a suppression weapon from the deck. He held it loosely at his side, not aimed at anything. "Davern," he said. The commander was quiet. "The 4 behind you are following orders," Rail said. "I understand that. Tell them to go back to their ship." "And if I don't?" "Then they get hurt and you still lose," Rail said. "And I'm tired, and my shoulder is going to bruise badly, and I'd rather not." A silence stretched through the cargo bay, 8 operators down, suppressant foam still draining through the floor grates. The distant, mechanical sound of the ship's transit drive, indifferent to everything happening inside it. Davern looked at the 4 operators. "Stand down," he said. "Return to the shuttle." One of the 4 said, "Commander." "Return to the shuttle," Davern said. "Now." They went. Asha heard the airlock cycle. Davern looked at Rail across the bay. "You know this doesn't end here. He'll send more." "I know," Rail said. "We'll be at Veth Minor before he can organize more." "You can't know that. I've been running this lane for 11 years. I know the transit times." Davern looked at him for a long moment. "You were always better at this than you thought you were," he said. "That was never the problem." "I know what the problem was," Rail said. Davern walked to the airlock. He stopped at the threshold. "The civilians," he said without turning around. "From the Harvest raid, did they ever?" "I don't know," Rail said. "I've wanted to." The airlock cycled. The constant margin registered the departure of the boarding shuttle, and then the 3 interdiction cruisers on the long-range board began to move, not toward them, but away, breaking off on a heading that would take them back to Kalefaction space. Rail stood alone in the cargo bay for a moment. Then he sat down on the floor next to a fallen container, rested his forearms on his knees, and looked at the deck. Asha unlocked the cockpit hatch. She found him still sitting when she came down. She stood at the cargo bay entrance and looked at the evidence of the last 11 minutes, 8 people who were breathing, none of whom would be waking up soon, 600 kilos of freight containers strewn across deck plating, suppressant foam drying in patches on every surface, the suppression valve she'd identified leaking a last slow drip of chemical white onto the deck. Rail looked up when she came in. "You weren't supposed to open the hatch," he said. He didn't sound annoyed. He sounded tired. "The boarding team has departed," she said. "The risk calculus changed." "Fair," he looked at his shoulder. The jacket was scorched through to the shirt beneath, and a patch of skin visible through the tear was an angry reddish-gray that would deepen to bruise purple over the next few hours. "We're about 6 hours from Veth Minor. We should be clear of interdiction range within 90 minutes. "You set the magnetic locks deliberately," she said. He looked up. "The port wall rack. You calibrated the release threshold to the thermal output of sustained suppression fire at that range. You needed them to fire from that position long enough to trigger the release, which is why you let the fire continue instead of advancing. She studied his face. You planned the bay before they arrived. I've been boarded before, he said. Cargo lanes attract opportunists. That was not an opportunistic boarding. That was a coordinated interdiction by 3 military-class vessels. Same principles, Rail said, bigger scale. Ashak crossed the bay and sat down on a container that wasn't going anywhere. She looked at him across the space between them, which was about 3 meters, and felt, in that moment, simultaneously like very little and like something she wasn't sure how to measure. Tell me about the disciplinary incident, she said. His expression didn't change in any dramatic way. It shifted slightly, the way old material shifts when you press on it, showing you it has density you didn't anticipate. We were running a suppression operation against a harvest-trading fleet in the Orland Corridor, he said. Standard doctrine, disable their logistics ships, force the combat vessels to break off. My wing was assigned to hold position and intercept any retreating vessels. He paused. One of the retreating vessels was a converted civilian hauler. It was carrying workers from 3 outer settlements. Conscripted workers, the raiding fleet pulled labor from wherever they found it. The vessel was broadcasting civilian codes. He looked at his hands. My orders were to disable all retreating vessels without exception, no discrimination by ship type. You refused. I let the civilian hauler pass and escorted it to a neutral beacon, he said. Then I returned to position. We completed the mission. Nobody was harmed in the operation who wasn't already a combatant. And your commanding officer said I had broken the integrity of a coordinated command response. Said if every officer made individual determinations about which orders to follow based on personal assessment, the chain of command became meaningless. He said it without inflection, as if reciting something he'd reviewed so many times it had lost texture. He wasn't entirely wrong. That's the part that took me a long time to settle with. But you would do it again, Asha said. He looked at her. Yes, he said. It was the first entirely unguarded thing he had said to her. She looked at the cargo bay around her, the foam, the scattered containers, the 8 people who were alive who might not have been. When we land, she said carefully, I will be requesting a full review of your Article 14 discharge. That's not necessary, he said. It is not necessary for you, she said. It is necessary for the record. A record of a man who allowed 12 combatants to board his ship and was unable to prevent them is not an accurate record. Something shifted in his expression again. That's a creative interpretation of what happened here. It is the accurate interpretation, she said. What happened here was that 12 combatants attempted to prevent the legal heir of House Vane from reaching her ratification appointment, and they failed. She looked at him. The record should reflect what actually occurred. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at his shoulder. There's a medical kit in the forward locker, he said. Left side, behind the spare transponder. I will get it. You don't have to. I am aware, she said, and went to get it. They sat in the cargo bay together while he directed her through the basic treatment of the suppression burn, coolant foam, wrap, don't flex, give it 6 hours. He did not make it dramatic. He told her what to do in the same flat, instructional voice he'd used to describe the transit schedule, and she did it. And when she'd finished, he flexed his fingers experimentally and said, good, in the tone of someone assessing a correctly loaded manifest. The Davan, she said, he knew you. We served together, Rail said. Before, he made different choices. He seemed to respect you. Respecting someone and working against them aren't mutually exclusive. He adjusted his arm. He was following his orders. I was following mine. We each think we were right. We might both be. Do you believe that? I believe the people who write orders are not always in the room where the consequences live, he said. Sometimes the person in the room has to decide, and sometimes they're wrong, and sometimes they're right, and it doesn't matter because the institution needs them to be wrong anyway. He looked at the deck. I spent a long time being angry about it. Now I mostly just carry equipment. Asha was quiet. The workers from the harvest raid, she said, from the Orlan corridor. I don't know what happened to them, he said. The exchange protocol Devon mentioned, the one that was supposed to happen in 6 weeks, never materialized because the political situation in that corridor fell apart around the same time. I filed requests for follow-up for about 2 years before the records office told me the case file had been closed. He paused. Davin said the exchange never happened because I broke the suppression doctrine. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if the exchange would have happened even if I'd followed orders. The people who could tell me aren't required to. Asha thought about her father, who had spent 30 years trying to build the kind of institutional structure that would mean men like Rael Muse got answers to questions like that. Her father, who was now dead, and the structure he'd built was holding, barely, contingent on her reaching a room on Veth Minor in 4 days. I am going to reach the assembly, she said. I know, Rael said. You sound certain. We're in clear space, we have a 6-hour transit, and the people who wanted to stop you already spent their one good opportunity. He shifted his weight against the container. Your uncle will have to find another argument. He will try. Probably, Rael said, but he'll have to try it in court, which is your environment and not mine. He almost smiled, not quite, but the corners of his eyes moved in a way that suggested the possibility. I think you'll be fine there. She considered him. You said earlier that this assignment was because the pay was decent, she said, and that you needed a coolant manifold. True. Is that the only reason you took it? He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Director Saul told me who I was transporting, he said. She didn't have to, it's not in the standard briefing. He looked at his hands. She told me that if the heir of House Vane doesn't reach Veth Minor, the succession crisis doesn't resolve, and a civil war starts, and the first 3 systems to suffer disruption are the 3 that supply agricultural equipment to 14 outer settlements on the corridor lanes. He paused. 14 settlements is a lot of people. You took the job for the outer settlements, she said. I took the job for a coolant manifold, he said. I stayed careful because of the settlements. Asha looked at him, the worn jacket now damaged, the burn on his shoulder wrapped in the ship's medical foam. The man who had, 11 minutes ago, controlled an 800-kilo cargo release by calibrating a magnetic lock threshold to a thermal output he'd calculated in his head before the boarding team arrived. Who had let 12 people onto his ship because he'd already decided where they were going to be when they left. Rael Muse, she said. When we land, after the assembly, I intend to have your file reviewed and your commission reinstated if you want it. I don't want the commission, he said. I'm not sure I'd know what to do with a chain of command anymore. Then not the commission, she said. The record, I want the record to be accurate. He looked at her for a long moment. That's fair, he said. Veth Minor appeared on the forward display as a pale gray-white sphere wrapped in the silver of its cloud cover. Asha was back in the co-pilot chair. Rael was flying with his uninjured arm and had stopped arguing about whether she needed to be in the cockpit. The approach corridor was clear. The assembly confirmation signal was waiting. Her office had already transmitted the arrival notice, the ceremony scheduled, the witnesses assembled. The succession crisis was, in 4 days, going to be over. What will you do after this? She asked. Pick up a cargo contract on the way back, he said. I've been running empty one direction for too long. You should rest your shoulder. I'll rest it on the return leg. He began the descent sequence. There's a settlement on the Orlan outer loop that's been waiting on a filtration component delivery for 6 weeks. I told them I'd get it there before the 3rd month. Asha said, you know the outer settlements by their supply schedules. I know them the way you know the assembly floor, he said. It's just a different kind of route. She watched the planet grow in the viewport. The cloud cover shifted, and she saw, briefly, the lights of the capital district rising up through the silver-white haze, warm and gold against the gray. "The file," she said, "when it's reviewed, will you at least let me document what happened today accurately?" "What happened today," he said, "is that 12 people attempted to board a registered neutral carrier, failed to complete the boarding, and departed of their own accord." He paused. "I'd say that's accurate." "That is extraordinarily accurate," she said, "and also extraordinary." He said nothing, which was, she was beginning to understand, his version of receiving a compliment. The constant margin entered the approach lane. The assembly signal blinked confirmation. Below, on a world that had been waiting 8 months for this, the neutral witnesses were already gathering. "Thank you," Asha said, "for taking the job." "The coolant manifold worked out," Rail said. "So did everything else." The ship descended through the cloud cover, and the lights of the capital came up around them, warm and steady. And outside the viewport, the world was very large and very ordinary and entirely intact. 3 weeks later, in the records office of the Concord Directorate, a file was updated. Rail Muse, former Wing Tactical Officer, Concord Armed Services. Discharged under Article 14. Appended to the file, by order of the newly ratified heir of House Vane, was a single supplementary document, an incident report from the Veth Minor Transit Lane, filed in active tense, describing the events of a 14-hour transit leg in which a Hero-class light freighter operated by the above-named individual had encountered a 3-vessel interdiction attempt by a foreign political faction, successfully protected its VIP cargo, and arrived at destination without loss of life. Attached to the incident report was a classification. Escort active credential, reinstated by direct witness testimony. And on a separate shelf, in a separate office, a coolant manifold sat in its shipping crate, already ticketed for the Orlan Outer Loop, next departure in 2 days. Rail Muse had prepaid the freight. He was someone at the freight terminal, mentioned to no one in particular, apparently very reliable.